Jack Carter stood at attention as the alien general spoke, his eyes scanning the strange, distant faces in the crowd of soldiers. They were a mix of humanoid forms, their skin shades ranging from pale green to deep purple, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jack's uniform, marked with the scars of countless battles, felt out of place among the brightly colored armor of the aliens, yet he held himself proudly. He had fought alongside them in the war, and now, as the winner of a crucial battle, he was being honored by their commander. Jack Carter, human warrior, the general's voice boomed, cutting through the silence of the crowded hall. You have proven yourself in the heat of battle, defeating our enemies in ways we did not think possible. As a token of our gratitude, we present you with a prize, a gift of value, to honor your bravery. Jack's heart raced, but not from excitement. He had always fought for his people, not for rewards or recognition. He'd seen enough cruelty in the galaxy to know that gifts from alien warlords often came at a high cost. He glanced around the room, wondering what this gift might be. The doors to the grand chamber creaked open, and two armored soldiers walked in, dragging a woman behind them. Her long, silvery hair cascaded down her back. Her skin was a deep shade of violet, and her eyes were closed, as if resigned to whatever fate had brought her here. The soldiers shoved her forward, making her stumble. Her hands were bound tightly in chains, and her body was bruised, as though she had been through a great deal of hardship. Jack's stomach twisted as the woman was presented before him, her head held low in shame. He could see the pain in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world rested on them. "This is Lyra," the general said, a wicked smile playing on his lips, "a captured princess from a rival species. She is yours, Carter, a token of our appreciation for your service." Jack's jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel his blood boiling as the general's words sank in. A slave, a woman who had been treated like property, as if her life meant nothing more than a prize to be given away. "This isn't a gift," Jack muttered under his breath, but his voice was loud enough for those around him to hear. The general gave a dismissive wave. "It is what it is, soldier. She belongs to you now. Treat her well, and perhaps you'll find more value in her than just a symbol of your success." Jack stepped forward, his eyes locked on the woman. She looked up at him briefly, her violet eyes filled with an unreadable expression. For a moment, their gazes met, and he saw something there, a flicker of hope, of recognition, as if she understood what he was about to do. "Remove her chains," Jack ordered firmly, his voice carrying an air of command. The soldiers hesitated but quickly obeyed, unclasping the cold, heavy shackles from her wrists. The moment the chains fell to the ground, Lyra straightened slightly, though she still seemed wary, unsure of what Jack's actions meant. Jack turned to the general, his voice cold and firm. "I didn't ask for this. I won't accept it." The general's smile faded slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "You have no choice, human. She is yours. Do with her as you please." Jack's mind raced. He had no idea how to handle this situation. He couldn't leave Lyra here, not with the way she had been treated. He could see the marks of abuse on her skin, the weariness in her eyes. But at the same time, he knew there was nothing he could do. The warlord's law was clear. He had been given the woman as a reward, and there were no easy ways out of this arrangement. Jack stood silently for a moment, contemplating his next move. Finally, he turned back to Lyra, his eyes softening. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a person, someone who deserved respect, not cruelty. "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I'll help you. I'll get you out of here." Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, a glimmer of disbelief crossing her face. For a moment, it seemed as if she didn't understand what Jack was offering. He could see her hesitation, the fear of what might come next, the fear that she might be traded again, or worse, treated as nothing more than an object. But Jack meant every word. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't going to let her suffer any longer. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice steady. "You're free now." The general chuckled behind him. "Free? You think you can just take her and go? You are a fool, Carter. She belongs to you, and you will do as you're told. There is no escaping that." But Jack ignored the warning. He moved closer to Lyra, his presence offering her a moment of peace in the storm of uncertainty. She blinked at him, still unsure, but there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of hope, a silent question. Could she trust him? Jack nodded to the soldiers who had brought her in. "Get out of here. I'm taking her with me." Now, there was a brief moment of tension, but when Jack's gaze remained unwavering, the soldiers backed off, leaving the room without another word. As they walked out of the hall, Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what the future held for them, or how they would navigate the dangers of this alien world. But he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let Lyra suffer any longer. Not if he could help it. Jack paced back and forth in the small, dimly lit room, trying to think of his next steps. Lyra sat silently in the corner, her eyes never leaving him. After the chaos of the ceremony, they had been escorted to this place, a temporary holding room until Jack could figure out what to do next. The walls were cold and metallic, the air slightly humid, but Jack wasn't focused on the environment. His mind was on the woman sitting across from him. She hadn't said a word since they had left the hall, and he could feel the weight of the silence hanging between them. Lyra, who had once been a noble from her people, now found herself a stranger in a world that didn't understand her, and worse, didn't seem to care. Jack didn't know what had happened to her or why she had been captured, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let her suffer anymore. "What's your name?" Jack finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, but there was a certain urgency behind it. He needed to know who she was, not just the prisoner standing in front of him. Lyra's eyes flickered toward him for a moment before she looked away, her gaze returning to the cold floor beneath her. She didn't answer. Jack frowned. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this wasn't it. She hadn't spoken a word since she'd been given to him, and the fact that she wasn't responding made him uneasy. Was she afraid of him, or was she just too broken to speak? "I'm Jack," he said softly, trying again. "I don't know what's happened to you, but I'm here to help. You're not a prisoner anymore. You're free." The words were simple, but Jack meant every one of them. He wanted her to understand that she wasn't just some reward or trophy, that she was a person, and he would do everything he could to make sure she knew that. Lyra looked up at him, her violet eyes meeting his for the first time. For a moment, Jack saw something flicker there, a tiny spark of something that resembled hope. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but then closed it again. Jack's heart ached at the sight. She wanted to speak, but something was holding her back. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was distrust. Whatever it was, Jack wasn't going to push her. He understood that trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned. He sat down on a nearby chair, keeping a respectful distance from her. "I know you probably don't trust me. I wouldn't either if I were you, but I promise you, I'm not like them. I won't hurt you. I just need to know your story." Lyra's expression didn't change. She didn't seem angry, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a kind of deep, unspoken pain. Jack wondered how long she had been held captive, how long she had been subjected to the cruelty of her captors. Jack leaned forward, his voice softening. "You don't have to tell me everything right away. I just want to help." For a long time, there was no response. Jack wasn't sure if she would ever speak, but he wasn't going to give up. He had to get through to her. He had to show her that there was more to life than pain and fear. Finally, Lyra spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" The question caught Jack off guard. It wasn't what he had expected. He had been ready to hear more about her past, about her people, about what had happened to her. Instead, she was asking him why he was even bothering with her. It stung in a way he didn't expect. He thought about his answer carefully before speaking. Because you don't deserve to be treated like this. No one does. I know I'm just one person, but I'll do what I can to make sure you're free. You deserve that. Lyra was quiet for a moment, as if she were processing his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was something. Jack felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was progress. She was beginning to trust him, even if just a little. And for now, that was enough. Over the next few hours, Jack kept the conversation light, asking her small questions about where she was from, about her life before she had been taken. Lyra was reluctant at first to answer, but as time passed, she seemed to relax. She told him about her home world, a place full of towering cities and vast landscapes, of a family she once loved and a kingdom she had once ruled. But Jack could tell that the pain of losing it all still lingered in her voice. Eventually, Lyra began to open up more, her words flowing a little easier as she spoke of her life before everything changed. Jack listened carefully, though he knew there was more she wasn't saying. But that was okay. He wasn't going to rush her. He just needed her to know that she wasn't alone anymore. As the day wore on, Jack made a promise to himself. He didn't know what kind of future awaited them, but one thing was certain. He was going to protect Lyra, no matter what. She wasn't his slave, she wasn't his property, and she certainly wasn't some kind of prize to be claimed. She was a person, and she deserved a chance at freedom, a chance to rebuild her life. The bond between them, while still fragile, was beginning to take root. Jack didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing the right thing. The days following their quiet conversations felt strange. Jack had never been one to care much for politics or royal power struggles, but Lyra's presence made him think differently. She wasn't just some alien prisoner. She was a woman with a history, a future, and a life that had been stolen from her. But as the days passed, Jack realized something that weighed heavily on his mind. While they were safe for the moment, this wouldn't last forever. They were living under the thumb of the warlord who had given her to him. He might have freed her physically, but they were still far from free. Jack sat by the small table in their room, tracing his fingers over the map of the star system laid out before him. They needed to get out of here, not just for his sake, but for Lyra's. They had to leave the warlord's reach before it was too late. But every plan he thought of seemed to fall apart before it even had a chance. Lyra sat on the bed across the room, staring out of the small window that offered little more than a view of the distant stars. Her face was unreadable, but Jack could see the faint flicker of unease in her posture. She was deep in thought, just as he was. "I've been thinking," Jack said, breaking the silence. He stood up and moved closer to her. "We need a way out. We can't stay here much longer." Lyra turned to look at him, her violet eyes steady. "I know. But where would we go?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the question. It was a good one, an important one. Jack scratched his chin, his mind racing for answers. He'd been thinking about the human colonies on the outer rim of the galaxy, far away from the warlord's influence. There, they could blend in, start fresh. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The warlord had spies everywhere, and they couldn't risk being tracked down before they made it off this planet. "We'll have to take a ship," Jack said slowly. "It's risky, but it's the only way. I've seen some smugglers passing through the spaceport. If we can make contact with them, they might be able to get us out." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "And if they don't help us?" Jack frowned. "We'll make them help." His words hung in the air for a moment before Lyra nodded slowly. She was no longer the quiet, broken woman who had first been brought to him. She was starting to take charge, just as she had in their earlier conversations. Jack was starting to see a woman with strength and resilience. "All right," Lyra said, her voice firmer now. "But we'll need to be smart. We can't just walk into a spaceport and expect to get away unnoticed." Jack grinned at her, feeling a sense of camaraderie growing between them. "I'm glad you're on board. I'll handle the details." You just stick with me." They made their way to the small spaceport the next morning, careful not to attract attention. Jack knew the layout of the place well from his time stationed here, so they stuck to the shadows, avoiding the more public areas. They were moving quickly, but quietly, blending in with the crowd of workers and travelers who passed through the port. As they reached a quieter part of the spaceport, Jack gestured for Lyra to follow him into a narrow alleyway between two warehouses. There, a man was waiting for them, his face shadowed beneath the hood of his cloak, but his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of someone who dealt in the underworld. "Are you sure about this?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. He didn't look like someone who asked questions for the fun of it, but Jack wasn't about to let his guard down. "I'm sure," Jack said firmly. "You'll get us out of here, and you'll be paid. You know the terms." The man nodded slowly, eyeing Lyra with suspicion. "She's not from around here. Are you sure you want to get involved in this? The warlord's people don't take kindly to escapes." Jack leaned forward. "I'm not asking for your opinion. Just take us to the ship, and we'll be gone. If you don't want the money, I can find someone else." The smuggler narrowed his eyes but said nothing further. After a tense silence, he turned and beckoned them to follow him. They moved quickly through the back alleys, careful not to draw attention. Jack could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise, his instincts screaming at him to be cautious. He was used to danger, but there was something about this situation that felt different. After what seemed like hours, they finally arrived at a small, discreet ship docked at the farthest corner of the port. It wasn't much, just a basic freighter, but it would get them to safety if they could make it aboard without raising alarms. The smuggler led them up the ship's ramp, and they entered the ship's narrow hallway. Inside, it was dark, and the air smelled of stale food and oil. Jack's eyes scanned the space, looking for any signs of trouble. But the ship was empty, just as the smuggler had promised. "All right," Jack said quietly. "We're almost there. We just need to keep our heads down, stay out of sight, and we'll be off this planet before anyone notices." But just as he said those words, the ship's engines suddenly hummed to life, and the lights flickered on. Jack's heart skipped a beat. They were already preparing to take off. Lyra looked at him with wide eyes, her fingers clutching the side of the wall. Jack took a deep breath. It wasn't just an escape anymore. It was a race against time, and the warlord's forces who would stop at nothing to find them. "We need to move. Now," Jack said, his voice urgent. "Stay close to me." They made their way to the control room, where the smuggler was already seated, preparing to take off. But the moment Jack stepped inside, the man's face twisted into a sneer. "This isn't how it was supposed to go," the smuggler growled, his hand moving toward a hidden weapon. Jack's mind raced, and his body tensed. They had to act fast. If they didn't, their escape would end before it even started. The moment the smuggler's hand moved toward the weapon hidden beneath his jacket, Jack's instincts kicked in. His mind raced, quickly calculating their options. He had never been one for violence, but in this moment, there was no room for hesitation. Their lives were at stake. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Jack said, his voice calm but filled with an edge of warning. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the smuggler and Lyra. The last thing he needed was for her to get caught in the crossfire. The smuggler's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but the sneer remained on his face. "You think I'm afraid of you?" He laughed, the sound low and mocking. "You're on my ship now. You're not going anywhere." Jack's pulse quickened, his fingers flexing as he considered his next move. He had no idea who this smuggler was working for, but it was clear now that they weren't the only ones who wanted off the planet. "Lyra, stay back," Jack whispered, his voice low but firm. He didn't want her caught up in this mess, not when she'd already suffered enough. She nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. But there was something else in her gaze now, a spark of determination. She wasn't as helpless as she seemed. The smuggler took another step forward, his hand tightening around the grip of the weapon. Jack didn't waste any more time. With a swift motion, he reached for the smuggler's wrist, twisting it sharply. The weapon clattered to the ground with a metallic clang. "Enough," Jack growled, shoving the man back against the console. "This is how it's going to go. You're going to take us off this planet, and you're going to keep your hands to yourself. Got it?" For a moment, the smuggler just glared at Jack, breathing heavily. But the look in Jack's eyes left no room for argument. The smuggler had made his choice by betraying them, and now he had to live with it. The fear of the warlord's wrath was enough to make anyone think twice about crossing him. With a begrudging grunt, the smuggler stepped away from the control panel and sat down in the captain's seat. He didn't speak for a few moments, just staring straight ahead, but Jack could tell the tension wasn't over. The ship still hadn't lifted off, and the smuggler's hands were trembling. Lyra stepped forward cautiously, her eyes never leaving the smuggler. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why betray us now?" The smuggler turned his head, his lips curling into a scowl. "It's not personal. I have a deal with the warlord. If I get you back, I get paid. You're just a piece of the puzzle, princess." Jack's eyes narrowed. "So, you're working for the warlord. I should have known." The smuggler didn't answer, his silence confirming Jack's suspicion, but there was something about his demeanor now, something that didn't quite add up. If he truly worked for the warlord, why hadn't he turned them over already? Why go to such lengths to get them on his ship and off the planet? Jack kept his guard up, but his mind raced with the possibilities. He couldn't afford to trust this man completely, but he had to admit there was something about the situation that felt strange. It wasn't like most of the smugglers he had dealt with in the past. This one seemed almost conflicted. "Let's just get out of here," Jack said after a tense pause, his tone firm but not aggressive. He didn't want to waste time figuring out the smugglers' motivations. They had to leave now. The longer they stayed on the planet, the greater the chances of being discovered. The smuggler hesitated for a moment before he nodded, his hands hovering over the controls. "Fine, but you're not out of the woods yet. There are plenty of ships still looking for you, and we won't be the only ones heading out of here." Jack glanced at Lyra, who gave him a look that suggested she was already thinking ahead. There was no question now. They had to stay ahead of the warlord's forces. If the smuggler had any idea where they were headed, they had to get there first. With a low hum, the ship's engines roared to life, the vibrations running through the floor beneath their feet. The smuggler's hands moved quickly across the control panel, and the ship lurched as it lifted off from the ground. They were free for now. But Jack didn't let his guard down. Not yet. The smuggler may have been true to his word for the moment. But Jack knew better than to trust anyone in this kind of situation. They were still in danger, and the path ahead would not be easy. As the ship ascended through the atmosphere, Jack looked over at Lyra, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. She had come a long way since he first met her, and he could see the change in her. She was no longer the quiet, broken woman she had been when she was presented to him. She was strong, determined, and ready to fight for her freedom. "Where will we go?" Lyra asked, her voice quieter now, but still steady. Jack thought for a moment, staring out the small window as the planet below them grew smaller and smaller. The warlord's reach was far, and they would need to find a safe place, a place where they could start over. "I've heard about a human colony on the outer rim," Jack said. "It's far enough away from here that we might be safe. We'll take it one step at a time, but that's our first stop." Lyra nodded, her face set with resolve. "Then let's go." They didn't speak much more after that. The smuggler didn't offer any more information, and Jack didn't ask. They had what they needed for now: a ship, a plan, and each other. But in the back of his mind, Jack knew the hardest part was still to come. They had escaped the warlord's clutches, but they would need to stay one step ahead to survive. He wouldn't let anything happen to Lyra, not on his watch. The ship surged forward into the blackness of space, its engines humming steadily beneath their feet. For the first time since they'd met, Jack allowed himself to relax, if only slightly. They were free from the warlord's direct reach, at least for now. But the thought of what lay ahead made his grip on the sea tighten once more. Lyra stood by the small window, her expression distant as the stars streaked past them. Jack could tell she was lost in thought. They hadn't talked much since leaving the planet. He didn't want to push her, but he knew they couldn't remain silent forever. They had a future to plan, and they needed to make decisions together. The smuggler, whose name they still hadn't learned, sat at the helm, his hands expertly guiding the ship through the unknown. Jack watched him carefully. While the man had kept his word so far, Jack remained skeptical. The fact that they were on the run from a powerful warlord meant that there was no room for mistakes, no room for miscalculations. They couldn't afford to trust anyone too easily. Finally, Jack spoke, breaking the silence. "We need to lay low once we reach the outer rim," he said, his voice steady. "We're not out of danger yet. There's no telling how far the warlord's influence stretches." Lyra turned to face him, her violet eyes filled with understanding. "I know, but we can't keep running forever. Eventually, we'll need to stop and find a place to rebuild. A place where we can stay safe." Jack nodded. "I agree. But first, we need to get to the colony. After that, we'll figure it out." She walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the metal floor. "How do you know we can trust this smuggler?" Her voice was calm, but Jack could hear the doubt in her words. Jack gave her a reassuring smile, though his mind was still racing. "I don't fully trust him, but right now, he's our only option, and he knows the fastest route to the outer rim. Once we're out of the warlord's reach, we'll have more options." Lyra seemed to accept his answer, though Jack could see that she wasn't entirely convinced. She didn't have to be. They were in this together, and they both knew they couldn't afford to make any wrong moves. The smuggler, who had been quietly monitoring the ship's systems, glanced over his shoulder. "We'll be reaching the outer rim in a few hours," he said. His voice was neutral, almost emotionless. "You'll want to prepare. Once we hit the outer sectors, we'll have to go off the grid. It's the only way to avoid detection." Jack leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "And how do we know you won't hand us over once we get there?" he asked bluntly. It was a question that had been nagging at him since the moment they'd stepped onto the ship. The smuggler's eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time, Jack saw a hint of emotion, a flash of something that looked like guilt. The smuggler didn't answer right away, as though weighing his words carefully. "I don't want any trouble with the warlord," he finally said, "but I've got my own reasons for helping you." His voice was low, almost as though he was speaking more to himself than to Jack. "I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing it because I don't want to owe him any more favors." Jack didn't fully trust the man, but for now, it was enough. They had no other choice but to continue forward. The hours passed slowly, the ship drifting farther and farther from the planet they had just escaped. Jack kept to himself, his thoughts never far from Lyra. She had been through so much, and despite her quiet strength, he knew it wasn't easy for her. He wanted to offer her more answers, reassurance, but he didn't have them. Not yet. Lyra finally sat down beside him, her eyes fixed on the stars outside. "What happens after we reach the colony?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. Jack glanced at her, the weight of her question settling over him. "After we reach the colony, we'll lay low, find a place to stay, get jobs, and start fresh. We'll figure out what comes next when we're safe." Lyra nodded, though Jack could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "And the warlord?" Jack hesitated. "We'll have to deal with him eventually, but not now. Right now, we need to survive. We'll figure out how to get rid of him once we're stronger." She didn't respond, but Jack could tell she was thinking. Her face was set in that familiar, determined expression. She wasn't just along for the ride. She was taking charge of her own future. As the hours passed, and the ship's hum became a comforting background noise, Jack couldn't help but wonder what kind of life they would build together. The galaxy was vast, full of danger and opportunity, but Jack was starting to think that with Lyra by his side, they could face whatever came their way. "We should sleep while we can," Jack suggested after a while. "We'll need our strength for what comes next." Lyra nodded, her posture relaxing slightly as she stood. "Good idea." Jack didn't know how long he'd sleep or if he'd sleep at all. He hadn't really rested since this whole mess began, but he knew they had to keep moving, keep thinking ahead. As Lyra made her way to a small cot in the corner of the room, Jack stood by the window for a moment longer, watching the stars streak past them. His mind was spinning, but he was sure of one thing. He wouldn't let anything happen to Lyra, not while he still had breath in his body. In the distance, he could see the edge of the outer rim approaching, an entire new world, a new beginning, and maybe even a new life for them both. But as they neared it, Jack's instincts told him that their journey was far from over. The journey through the outer rim was silent but tense. As the ship drifted farther into uncharted space, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every passing star and asteroid field felt like a warning. They weren't safe yet. Lyra had spent most of the day resting, still recovering from everything she had endured. Jack respected her need for peace, but it wasn't easy for him to relax. He spent his time thinking about the warlord, about the smugglers' true intentions, and most of all, about their future. They needed to make it to the colony, and they needed to do it soon. The smuggler had been quiet, focusing on the ship's systems and making sure they were still off the grid. His earlier admission about his dislike for the warlord had been curious, but Jack didn't let his guard down. He kept his eyes on the man, aware that any wrong move could cost them everything. It wasn't long before the calm silence was interrupted by a sudden, jarring sound, a low, mechanical hum that vibrated through the ship's walls. Jack's muscles tensed, and he immediately stood, glancing at Lyra, who had also sat up, her expression alert. "What's that?" Lyra asked, her voice shaky, but firm. The smuggler's face tightened as he looked at the readouts on his console. "We've got company," he muttered under his breath. His hands flew over the controls as he tried to make sense of the incoming signal. "They're not showing up on the radar. It's like they're cloaked." Jack's instincts flared to life. His eyes narrowed. "A cloaked ship. How long have they been following us?" "Could be hours. Or longer," the smuggler replied, his voice strained. "But it's definitely not a coincidence." Jack moved toward the cockpit, his mind racing. "Who's out there?" The smuggler's fingers hovered over the controls, and for a moment, there was a heavy silence. "It's a bounty hunter ship," the smuggler finally said, his voice tight. "I know the signature. They're here for you." Jack's heart sank. The warlord must have sent them. He should have known they wouldn't be able to escape so easily. He turned to Lyra, who was standing behind him now, her face pale but determined. "They know where we are. We need to make a decision," Jack said, his voice low but urgent. "We either try to outrun them or prepare for a fight." Lyra's gaze flickered to the window, where the distant outline of a ship was beginning to emerge from the shadows of space. It was massive, its sleek design almost blending with the stars around it, but Jack could see the faint outline of weapons mounted along the sides. "We don't have much time," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "What do you suggest?" Jack's mind raced, calculating their options. They couldn't afford to fight. They didn't have the resources or the firepower. But running wasn't guaranteed either. The bounty hunter ship was faster, more advanced, and they had the advantage of surprise. Still, Jack wasn't going to give up without a fight. Not now, not when they were so close to safety. "We'll try to outrun them," Jack said, his voice resolute. "But we need to get to a nearby asteroid field. If we can lose them in the debris, we might have a chance." The smuggler nodded, his face grim. He was already navigating the ship toward the nearest asteroid belt. Jack gripped the side of the cockpit, his heart pounding in his chest. They had to make it. The ship lurched as the smuggler pushed the engines to their limits, the hum of the engines rising in pitch. Jack could see the bounty hunter ship moving into position behind them, its sleek silhouette cutting through the void like a predator on the hunt. "We won't be able to keep this up for long," the smuggler warned, his fingers moving rapidly over the controls. "That ship's faster and better armed than we are. We'll need to find a place to hide, and fast." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes wide. "Can we make it to the asteroid field?" Jack glanced at her, his expression set. "We don't have a choice. We have to try." The ship rocketed forward, and the asteroid field slowly grew closer, the massive chunks of rock appearing like dark shadows in the distance. Jack's grip tightened on the chair as the ship dodged smaller asteroids, heading toward the larger, more treacherous obstacles that would make it harder for their pursuers to follow. The bounty hunter ship followed, unrelenting in its pursuit. Jack could feel the heat of the chase in his bones. Every second felt like an eternity, the ship's engines pushing harder and harder, the sound of the engines rising to a deafening roar. Suddenly, the ship shuddered violently, and a loud bang rang through the hull. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he realized they had been hit. He glanced at the smuggler, who was swearing under his breath as he struggled to maintain control of the ship. "We've been hit," the smuggler said, his face pale. "We've got a hole in the hull. We're losing pressure." "Where?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "Near the engine room," the smuggler replied, his eyes frantic. "We're not going to make it unless we patch it up." Jack's mind raced. They didn't have the luxury of time. They needed to act quickly. "Lyra, stay here," Jack said, his voice urgent. "I'll take care of the damage." Before she could protest, he dashed down the corridor, his mind focused on one thing: getting the ship patched up before they were completely vulnerable. As Jack made his way to the engine room, he couldn't help but wonder if they were going to make it out alive. The bounty hunter ship was closing in fast, and the damage to the hull was worse than he had hoped. But Jack wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not with Lyra's life on the line. Jack's heart raced as he bolted down the narrow corridors of the ship, his footsteps echoing in the metal halls. The damage was bad. The hull was breached, and they were losing air. If they didn't patch it up quickly, the ship wouldn't survive the pressure, let alone outrun the bounty hunter. His mind was sharp, but the urgency of the situation made his thoughts race even faster. He had to make sure Lyra was safe. She had been through so much already. The last thing he wanted was for her to be in danger again. He reached the engine room and immediately rushed to assess the damage. The crack in the hull was significant, and the pressure was starting to drop rapidly. He knew they didn't have much time. Grabbing a toolkit from the corner of the room, Jack worked as quickly as he could, tightening bolts and sealing the crack. Sweat dripped down his face as he struggled to hold everything in place, the ship's groaning and shaking around him. It was like a race against time, and the stakes were higher than ever. Come on," Jack muttered under his breath, working faster. His hands were shaking, but he couldn't afford to be slow. He needed to finish this, or everything would be lost. Meanwhile, back in the cockpit, Lyra's voice came through the comm system, sharp and clear. "Jack, what's happening? We're running out of time." He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I'm working on it. Just stay there and stay safe, all right." The connection went silent, and Jack pushed himself even harder. His eyes scanned the ship's systems on the screen, making sure the pressure was stabilizing as he worked. He didn't have a backup plan. This was it. If he couldn't seal the hull, they'd be sitting ducks for the bounty hunter. Outside, he could still see the bounty hunter ship gaining on them, its silhouette growing larger with each passing second. The crew aboard that ship had no idea what kind of trouble they were about to encounter. They underestimated how far Jack was willing to go to protect the woman he cared about. With one final wrench, Jack tightened the last bolt. The ship shuddered, and a low hum filled the room as the pressure slowly began to return to normal. He wiped his forehead, a sense of relief washing over him. "I did it," Jack said to himself, his voice full of exhaustion but satisfaction. He rushed back to the cockpit, barely stopping to catch his breath. As he entered the control room, Lyra looked up at him, her face tense but hopeful. "We're patched up," Jack said, his hands gripping the back of the seat. "But we're not out of the woods yet." The bounty hunter ship was only a few miles away, and it wasn't slowing down. Jack quickly checked the ship's power levels, knowing they didn't have enough fuel to outrun them for long. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Jack said, his voice steady despite the pressure. "We need to buy some time." Lyra nodded, her eyes full of determination. "Let's do this." The smuggler, who had remained quiet until now, leaned in and started making adjustments to the ship's controls. "I'll do my best to keep them off our tail, but they'll find us eventually." Jack glanced at the scanner, then back at Lyra. "We'll do what we can. Just trust me." The ship lurched as the smuggler engaged the engines at full power. They shot forward, diving into the asteroid field with the bounty hunter ship hot on their heels. The larger ship's weapons fired, the sharp whine of blaster bolts cracking through the air. One hit the asteroid just ahead of them, sending debris flying in all directions. Jack's pulse quickened, but he held steady. The ship darted between massive rocks, twisting and turning with precision, as the bounty hunter followed. He could see the enemy ship's shadow growing closer, but he refused to give up. "Hold tight," Jack yelled as they barely avoided an incoming asteroid. Lyra's fingers tightened around the controls, and Jack could see the strain on her face. She was doing her best, but the stakes were too high. The bounty hunter ship was gaining, its massive engines pushing forward with unrelenting force. Jack needed something more, something to turn the tide in their favor. "Is there a way we can outrun them?" Lyra asked, her voice tight with worry. "I've got an idea," Jack said, his mind racing. "I just need to get them into position." They weaved through the asteroid field, narrowly dodging the incoming fire from the enemy ship. Every moment counted. Jack could feel the tension in the air, but he kept his focus sharp. Finally, the moment came. They had reached a narrow canyon between two massive asteroids, the perfect place for a quick escape. Jack gritted his teeth. "Now," he shouted. Lyra executed the maneuver perfectly, diving between the massive rocks, using the terrain to their advantage. The bounty hunter ship was right behind them, but it didn't have the agility to follow through. As they turned sharply, the bounty hunter ship miscalculated and smashed straight into the canyon wall, sending sparks flying. The explosion was bright and loud, but Jack and Lyra didn't look back. They kept pushing forward, the sound of the destruction fading behind them. Their hearts were racing, but they had survived. Barely. After a few moments, Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned to Lyra, a tired but relieved smile crossing his face. "That was too close," he said, shaking his head. Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "I knew you had a plan." Jack reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "I couldn't have done it without you." As the ship continued to glide through the stars, Jack and Lyra finally allowed themselves to relax. The bounty hunter was gone. The warlord's threat pushed back, at least for now. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. But Jack wasn't afraid. With Lyra by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. Together, they would fight for a future, a life they could build away from the shadows of the past. The stars stretched before them, an endless horizon of possibilities. And for the first time, in a long while, Jack allowed himself to dream of a peaceful life.